A very good morning to all. My name is Kirti Jain and I am a research scholar at the Department of Computer Science, University of Delhi, India. Currently, I am exploring epidemic dynamics in networks, and in this session, I will be presenting my work titled Regression Chain Model for Predicting Epidemic Variables. So I will begin with a brief introduction along with the related literature and then present my methodology and results. So, one of the greatest threats to global health is the spread of uncontrolled epidemics due to highly pathogenic infectious diseases. But here's some encouraging news. Although infectious diseases may be inevitable, but we have the power to stop them before they spread. So how can math help in an epidemic? The onset of COVID-19 pandemic has brought new attention to the models of infectious diseases. These models are basically set of equations that capture the complex reality in a simplified form. It is true that no equation can encompass all reality, but the idea is to capture enough of it to improve our ability to understand and predict. Such statistical models help us understand about how diseases spread and predict what will happen in future. For example, they can help us prepare for things like surges in demands of ICU beds and ventilators, or particularly help in exploring what might happen under various policy scenarios. So basically, these models proved valuable not by showing us what is going to happen, but what might happen. So, an epidemic curve, also known as epi curve, shows the number of cases in an outbreak over time. It provides key information about an outbreak. So, there are three metrics to measure the intensity of an outbreak: peak cases, peak day, and epidemic span. Peak cases are the maximum number of infected cases on a given day. The day when the cases are maximum is the peak day, and the span denotes the time period between the first and last infected cases. So the epidemic spread on contact networks is one of the most studied dynamics in network science and has important implications in real epidemic scenarios. Contact networks capture the quantitative information of contacts between pair of individuals in a population. Specifically, interventions to public places in contact networks can further suppress the epidemic with a large degree. So we observe that with interventions in place, the peak delays significantly with a reduced number of cases and longer epidemic span. So predictions or well-calibrated forecast can be very useful for short-term planning and preparedness. So this was a brief background of the epidemic dynamics on networks. So what are we interested in? We will see how the structure of a contact network influences the epidemic dynamics, and secondly, how we can exploit these characteristics to predict epidemic variables. Suppose we have two contact networks with the same population but with different spatial density. In network A, individuals on an average have fewer contacts and higher average distance between any two individuals in the network. So it is expected that epidemic will spread slowly in such networks with low spatial density. On the other hand, in network B, individuals have higher number of contacts with lower average distance. So we observe that epidemic spreads rapidly in such networks with early peaks, higher peak cases, and lower span. From this example, we show that the network properties distinctly influence epidemic dynamics and hence can be used for prediction. So from the last 3-4 years since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, this area has gained attention. These studies use relatively small sized networks with high number of network features to predict average number of infections. They train and evaluate their model performance using cross-validation only. So from these studies, we identified a few research gaps. First, the network sizes used in these studies is realistically small and the method does not scale for applications in real world. Also, since distance-based properties are computationally expensive, this limits the practical applicability of this approach to large networks. Moreover, peak day and span are also important metrics to be predicted for understanding an epidemic spread. So we try to fill these research gaps in our work. So can we predict the dynamical process using inexpensive network properties? So for any given contact network with information on its size and order, average number of contacts and average distance, is it possible that can we predict the three epidemic variables? So we explore machine learning to predict epidemic variables for large networks as an alternative to expensive network simulations. For this study, since there is no dataset available on the internet, we try to curate one and share with the research community for further investigation and understanding of epidemic dynamics on networks. Specifically, we compute 5 topological properties, namely the average degree, density, degree variance, clustering coefficient, and average path length. Subsequently, we simulate the epidemic spread on the network using SEIR model and note 3 dependent epidemic variables: peak day, peak cases, and span. Hence, we get a feature vector of 5 network properties and 3 target variables for each network. This dataset can be used by the research community for further investigation. So, based on the network sizes, we split our dataset into 3 partitions corresponding to small size networks called DSN, medium sized networks called DMN, and large size networks called DLN. Since the epidemic variables are correlated, we use regression chain model to capture the dependencies between the target variables. We set the order for the regression chain as peak day, peak cases, and span, as this order was empirically found to deliver best quality predictions among all possible orders. So this figure shows the framework for the regression chain model. We use 4 representative Bayes algorithms, namely decision tree, random forest, kernel rich, and XGBoost. To quantify the assessment of the prediction quality, we use 2 performance metrics, namely coefficient of determination and root mean squared error. Higher value of R2 scores indicate a better fit of the model with high predictive performance, while the lower value of RMSE implies high predictive accuracy. In line with our objective, we formulate the following research questions. How do the network properties influence the 3 epidemic variables? Is it possible to predict the 3 epidemic variables with reasonable accuracy using the regression chain model? And how sensitive is the performance of the model to the network size? In this experiment, we study the relationship between 3 selected network properties, that is the average degree, average clustering coefficient, and average shortest path length, with 3 epidemic variables through scatter plots. The scatter plot shows that the topological properties have a profound impact on the 3 epidemic variables. Networks with lower average degrees, high path lengths, and small clusterings have delayed peaks, lower peak cases, and larger span. In addition, low path lengths and high average degrees fuel the epidemic spread, leading to early peak day and high peak infections. We also observe that peak day has negative relationship with the peak cases. Early peak days result in higher peak cases and vice versa. On the other hand, peak day and span are positively related. Early peak days leads to shorter span. In conclusion, it is sufficient to conclude that network properties influence the epidemic variables and are potent predictors of epidemic spread. In this experiment, we assess the competence of the regression chain model for all 3 datasets by training and testing on similar and dissimilar sized networks. The matrix shows the heat map of R2 scores and the RMSE values. For example, the first entry of the cell corresponds to the model performance when the model is trained and tested on small-sized networks. The diagonal entries shows the cross-validated performance results on similar-sized networks. We observe that the performance of the random forest regressor is quite high. The non-diagonal entries show the model performance for unseen data. We observe that the overall high R2 scores and low RMSE values demonstrate the competence of the regression chain model for predicting the epidemic variables. Now we extend and present results of the previous experiment and report the model performance for each variable individually. The cross-validated performance is shown with the dark blue colored bars. We observe that the peak day and peak cases are predicted quite accurately, while the prediction of the span variable is comparatively low. Nevertheless, it is reasonable to conclude that the RCM are capable of predicting the epidemic variables using the network properties. Having observed that the model performance degrades for dissimilar sized networks, we examine the sensitivity of the predicted variable to the size of the network. We train our model on small size networks and test on large networks in batches. We group networks into 8 batches and report RMSE and R2 scores. We observe a marginal decrease in R2 score and a marginal increase in RMSE values for peak day and peak cases with increasing network size. However, for the span variable, the R2 score degrades notably for large networks. The further study is required to understand the role of the network properties on the span variable. In conclusion, our results establish the possibility of predicting the 3 epidemic variables using the regression chain model trained on the topological properties of the underlying contact networks, although the prediction of the third variable, that is the span, is challenging. We believe that this work will help advance the study of recognizing machine learning models that proxy for expensive simulation on large networks. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.